I'm not a forest ranger, but I used to be in a group that's somewhat like the Scouts. So we'd spent a lot of time in the woods. We encountered many weird things, but most of the time it was easy to explain. One thing happened though that to this day scares the living hell out of me. I was a leader for the age group 8 to 10 years old, and we were out on a camping trip. It was the first year we stayed on that terrain, and it was huge. Normally, we tend to explore the majority of a terrain before the kids arrive, so we were aware of any possible dangerous spots to avoid. This time, it was impossible. Every camp, we have what we call a night game. It's usually a scary game in which the kids have to complete several tasks while the leaders scare the ever-loving heck out of them. Like always, we had Vol.2 during that camp. We masked up as monsters and hid out in the woods close to the checkpoints they had to pass. While running in between checkpoints, I found an open stretch of forest with little to no foliage, so it was ideal for chasing after them. There was no real room to hide besides behind trees, so I couldn't use my flashlight or they'd be able to see me from miles away. It was dark, like the unsettling kind of dark that plays tricks on your eyes and you start imagining things that aren't real. During my stay there, I saw a shadow that was around my size running past me a few times. I couldn't see it very well, so I just assumed I was imagining things because nothing was there when I turned my flashlight on. The game was nearing its end and I saw the shadow again. This time, I could see it vaguely standing near a tree not too far away from me. I thought it was one of the other leaders hiding to scare kids and decided to go over there as it was about time to go back. I aimed my flashlight toward the tree, and while I was getting closer, I noticed that there was indeed someone standing there. They were dressed in what looked like a torn burlap sack and had their head covered with a few white plastic bags that looked like they were tied together. I started to feel pure dread. Something felt really off. I asked if everything was all right, but they didn't respond. The only thing I heard was this weird sound that sounded like someone knocking on wood. Nevertheless, I went a bit closer until I was about 15 feet away from this person. The knocking sound turned out to be that person smacking his head repeatedly into the tree, and I noticed he looked like a male. He was barefoot and his arms and legs were covered with crusted mud. His hands were in a weird, cramped position. I was convinced this was just one of the other leaders pulling a prank, so I told them to knock it off. He slowly turned his head and started walking towards me. Something inside me just told me to run. It didn't matter if it was just a stupid prank, and I ran away scared for nothing. If this wasn't a prank, it felt like I was in serious danger, so I ran as fast as I could. I heard him running after me, but I didn't want to turn around to look as I'd probably run into a tree. I arrived back at the campsite and every single person that could be dressed like that was already there. They couldn't have gotten there before me, and if they did, they sure as hell didn't have the time to change into their regular clothes. Still, I told them and that they gave me a good scare with that. They just looked weird at me, thinking I was trying to scare them, and we left it at that. The next day, I wanted to go check it out. Who knows, maybe some weirdo ate the wrong mushroom and might be out there dying from hypothermia. I took someone else with me just in case, and there was nothing but endless trees. We arrived at the tree where I saw the person banging his head, and there was a dead, skinned, decomposing rabbit nailed to the tree. The forest ranger and the cops arrived after we called them. They looked around quickly and brushed it off as just a prank from another scouting group or some kids from the nearby town and left it at that. We didn't notice anything weird after that, so it probably was a dumb prank, but seriously, some people have a messed up sense of humor. My family goes camping in Joshua Tree twice a year. This tradition has been going on for at least 60 years, and in that whole time, my family has only ever left early on 2 occasions. The first was when it rained up in the mountains and caused 3 inches of flash flood to wash out our camp at 4 a.m. The second time was much more terrifying, and none of us have an answer as to what actually happened. I was 12 at the time. It's the first night of camping, and I was in the girls' tent with all my girl cousins. About 6 of my male cousins were 10 feet away from us in another tent. My parents are closer to the road, along with 3 sets of uncles and aunts. All in all, there are about 20 of us. Most of our tents are the kind you can zip open at the top to see the stars. I always loved doing that because I'm a bad sleeper and it gives me something to look at when everyone goes to sleep. At one point, I close my eyes and I start to fall asleep when a small pebble from the humongous boulder next to our tent falls on top of the tent. I'm used to this because birds or squirrels often knock small debris around when they try to get at our food during the middle of the night. I open my eyes, and the first thing I see is someone who appears to be standing on top of the boulder. It's about 15 feet up in the air, looking down into our tents. The person seemed to be wearing tight clothing and was really skinny and oddly shaped. At first, I tell myself that it's one of my male cousins because they had been trying to scare us all night. But the person was moving really weirdly. Its head was moving back and forth like a cobra, and it kept crouching down on all fours and crawling down the face of the rock closer to us. Then it's crawling back up and pacing. At one point, it looked up at someone making noise at another campsite, and its eyes gleamed in the moonlight. I'm also entirely sure that it did not have the skull shape of a coyote or a mountain lion. It had a flat face with no snout, so I'm laying in my tent, freaking out and trying to rationalize what I'm looking at. A lot of time goes by, and this thing just continues to watch us and move its body in really strange ways. I think about screaming, but the thing keeps coming down the side of the rock, and I am afraid it would jump onto our tents and kill us. After some time, I hear someone shouts, "Hey, what are you doing?" It's my uncle. Suddenly, at like 3 a.m., everyone is awake. My female cousins are awake and confused, and 2 of my older male cousins jump out of their tent with an axe. For a few seconds, the thing stays completely still, but then my aunt and several of my cousins see it and they all scream. Someone finds a flashlight and they turn it on, but the thing jumps off the backside of the rock. A couple of seconds later, it runs and gallops out from behind the rock past our campsite. My uncle managed to shine a light on it for a second, and I still don't have any idea what I saw. The thing definitely didn't have clothes on, but was naked and had a dark mark on its side that I mistook for spandex. We hear screaming and thrashing from another campsite, and several of the guys in our group go over and investigate. Whatever the thing was escaped into another campsite and ran into a small 2-person tent. When the forest rangers got there, it was 4 a.m. and everyone was confused. My uncle and the people at the other tent say that it was a naked person. I definitely don't think it's a person, and thankfully 2 of my adult male cousins had also spent some time watching it and being absolutely terrified by it, so they agreed with me. We give them all the details we could, and one ranger tells us that it was probably a coyote or mountain lion with mange. The other ranger looks really concerned, and I think he went off into the night to look for it. Either way, it was way too big for a coyote, and I've tracked mountain lions back in college, and know for sure mountain lions do not move like that, nor look like that when they have mange. We all left and went home that night. Either there was a naked crazy person, a monster, or a mountain lion with mange running around. Whatever it was, it had spent at least an hour watching us. We stayed in hotels for a couple of years after that, and I've camped there at least 20 more times since then. I've never heard or seen anything like it since. About 2 years back, my wife and I decided to go tent camping for 3 days at Cane Hollow Campground in Allegheny State Park, New York. Of course, there were signs of bears in that area, and all precautions should be taken while camping. We were very used to this as we have camped in bear country before and have seen plenty in the wild from Michigan, Tennessee, and of course New York. We made it through our first 2 days without any trouble camping near the back of the campgrounds. On the 3rd day, we were at our campsite and we had a couple with a newborn baby camping 2 spots down from us. It was about 2 p.m. and the sun was fully out. The couple just put the baby to rest in the tent, and the father was getting something out of their bear box and headed towards their truck. Out of nowhere, a massive black bear charges into their campsite. Then, it takes a large duffel bag out of the bear box and begins ripping it apart. The wife and husband saw this. The father ran to grab the child, and the mother ran into the truck and started slamming on the horn. This made the bear grab the duffel bag, run only like 20 feet away, and started to eat whatever was inside. I was standing on top of our picnic table watching this bear, completely unafraid of any humans near it. The wife had also got on the phone and called park rangers to come to the campsite. 2 rangers came in a few minutes, one with a paintball gun and the other with a shotgun. At the same time, they rushed the bear. The ranger with the paintball gun was shooting the bear, and the man with the shotgun was shooting in the air. This is what it took to scare the bear for the first time. After that, the rangers told everyone it would be safe to stay as the bear should now be afraid of the people there. My wife and I felt safe enough and stayed up until about 1 in the morning, just talking and still a little anxious to go to sleep because of what we saw. If you've been to the forest at night, you probably know that it's rarely truly quiet. That night, we heard squirrels and were aware of a family of raccoons watching us, checking to see if we had food by our fire. So, the sound of small twigs breaking was common. It was getting late, and we decided to sit out until the fire died. There was one small flame left when I felt something to my right. I quickly turned on the flashlight, and there standing literally 5 feet away was the largest black bear I had ever seen. Came in quickly, but it wasn't running. As soon as I turned on the light, it stopped, lowered its head, and began to growl. It showed its chattering teeth while doing the lip quiver thing bears do when they're angry. With its head lowered even more, it began to sway, staring at me and my wife. After looking into it, I believe this movement is a sign of aggression from a predator and not at all a defensive move. My wife and I immediately stood up from our chairs. I suspect the bear thought we were smaller than we were because after standing, it started to focus more on our tent than us. I put my wife behind me and pushed her to the car and put her in the passenger seat. She smacked her head pretty hard on the roof of the car and was dazed while I walked around the front of the car. I got in the driver's seat. We looked at each other and realized the car keys were on the picnic right next to the bear. The only thought going through my head was the only advantage I had on this thing was that I knew where it was. After taking a deep breath, I got out of the car. Luckily, I had a baseball bat and began to walk toward the bear yelling. I was shouting at it to back up, loud enough that the whole campground could hear me. The bear, with its broad side facing me again, began to quiver its lips and growl again. I saw on its back right leg a huge chunk of hair missing. Under that, you could see its pale skin with what looked like bloody road rash. Also, for whatever reason, the bear was completely soaked even though it had not rained for several days. Only God knows what happened to that bear before it came at us. For some reason, the bear turned and walked back into the forest. Without a doubt, I know that bear was not scared of me, not one bit. My wife, feeling a need to protect me, came out of the car still stunned by hitting her head. I love her for thinking she could protect me, but it definitely scared me that she got out at all. We both watched as the bear walked back into the forest. Compared to our campsite, it was just a wall of blackness you couldn't see into. I heard it pace back and forth a few feet away from where I could see it, and then things went silent again. I quickly grabbed the keys, and we drove about 5 miles until we had cell phone reception. I have no idea how the wife earlier made a call from her campsite. We told the park rangers that we had a bear problem, and they acted like we were overreacting. They sent a local cop to check things out. I told the officer what happened, how strange this bear was acting, and that it might be injured. He also acted like we were overreacting and searched our campsite. Without getting anywhere near the area I pointed the bear went off to. They said it looked good and there was nothing that would be drawing in a bear. They also said we probably scared it off again, and it won't be back. It seemed to me and my wife that this was not true, and he was just trying to not get us to panic or anyone who overheard what happened. We packed up our whole campsite in about 10 minutes and planned to drive all the way home. It was about 3 a.m., and as we were leaving the site, we saw the campground filled with police vehicles. They were literally on every turn and more were still entering the area. I think it's safe to say that the cops knew this was a serious problem. Maybe they stayed there the rest of the night since most decided to park near people's campsites. To be honest, it felt like the bear wanted the element of surprise to attack us and was waiting in the woods a few feet away. Maybe it wanted the lights to go out first and for us to be asleep before it came in again. I'm glad we trusted our gut and got out of there. Also, if you were wondering, the campsite was mostly filled with people, and not even one person came to help, even though we went to help the other couple earlier before the rangers came. Luckily, no one was hurt, but this was an extremely close call. This happened at our family's remote cabin in the forests of Montana. The cabin is in a very isolated area, with the nearest neighbor living about 2 miles up a dirt road on the mountain. We decided to head to the cabin in mid-May, right after school got out, but we couldn't have a fire because the wood was too wet from the spring rains. My family drove up from southern Washington, joined by my 2 uncles and their kids. My mom, stepbrother, and I were also there, but no one else was around. The first night went smoothly. We spent the evening drinking root beer, at least for me since I was 12, shooting cans with BB guns and playing poker and other card games. We had a dinner of spaghetti, followed by roasting marshmallows, before heading to bed around 10:30. To understand the strange events that followed, you need to know the layout of the cabin. On the left side of the house, there's a staircase lined with old Christmas lights we never bothered to take down. On the second floor, there's a hallway with a balcony on the right side that overlooks the dining area and living room. On the left side of the hall, there are 3 doors, each leading to a bedroom. The first bedroom has 1 bed and no windows, and since there's no attic, the ceiling is around 25 to 28 feet high. In the second bedroom, where I slept with the other kids, there were 2 bunk beds and 1 regular bed. I slept on the top bunk on the right side, my stepbrother on the bottom bunk, and my cousins on the other bunk bed. There's a single window about 18 feet above the second story, so it's roughly 28 feet off the ground, facing the deep woods. That night, I lay in bed, wide awake thanks to my messed up sleep schedule. I found myself staring at the treetops illuminated by the moonlight when suddenly, a pale creature darted across the window. Keep in mind, this window is on a flat wall 28 feet up with no windowsill. The creature looked drained of blood, with deep red stains covering its skin. Naturally, as a brave 12-year-old, I let out a scream, my voice alternating between silent gasps and high-pitched screeches thanks to those awkward pubescent voice cracks. I woke up everyone in the cabin, and my cousin, who was 12 as well, fell off his bunk, thankfully without getting hurt. A few minutes later, I was surrounded by panicked family members, asking what was wrong. I had to explain to 3 adults and 2 younger kids about the terrifying pale figure, 28 feet off the ground, covered in blood. They told me it was probably just a vivid dream, but I insisted I had been awake the entire time. They told me to put on my shoes, and we went outside to check the window, but there was nothing there. The next day, I looked up at the back wall and noticed something we had missed the night before. Tiny scratches, about the size of pine needles, moving diagonally across the window, heading up towards the roof before abruptly stopping. I also noticed a tree limb had fallen from the tree near the end of the scratch marks, and it had deep scratches along the bottom and top. Naturally, I was freaked out for the rest of the day. I also noticed that the beer cans we had been shooting at were gone. I figured the adults had thrown them out, but then I found one about 50 feet away, riddled with holes and strange tears. It was odd, especially since we had portable trash cans, but I didn't dwell on it too much. The day continued much like the first, with us eating leftover spaghetti and going to bed around 10:45. I fell asleep around 12:10, but woke up almost immediately at 1 o'clock, thirsty for a glass of water. As I went downstairs, I heard tapping on the side door of the kitchen. Completely petrified, I stood still as a statue, watching in horror as a long, bony finger with an extra joint tapped on the glass. The creature's wrist was coming from the bottom of the glass, meaning it was crouching while tapping on the window. I slowly backed up the stairs, but halfway up, the tapping stopped. I froze as I heard footsteps moving around the cabin to the back, followed by scratching sounds climbing up the wall, and then a blood-curdling scream from my room. My youngest cousin had been awake when I got up for water, and they had heard the scratching and also saw the creature climb up the window. We left the cabin on the 3rd day. When we got home, we found the bars on our window bent. Those bars had been installed after a bear broke the window the previous year, and it had taken a vise and hammer to get them into place. The way the bars were bent this time suggested the creature had pushed them up towards the window, meaning this pale monster with the 5-jointed fingers was stronger than my very strong uncle. The adults never told us kids, but later in the year, they went back to replace the furnace and fix the bars. They were able to have a fire this time, but that night, they felt like they were constantly being watched and heard strange tapping on the side of the house. They brushed it off as the walls creaking, but since then, I've never slept easily at that cabin. Eventually, we sold the cabin, and I haven't had any paranormal experiences since. It was the night of September 20th, and a meteor shower was gracing the skies. My curiosity got the best of me, so I decided to head out late to catch a glimpse. It was exactly 1 a.m. when I stepped outside. I stood in the middle of the quiet street in front of my house, gazing up at the clear night sky, watching comets streak across the darkness. I was alone, surrounded by the stillness of the night. Across the road from my house, there's an expanse of dense forest that stretches for miles, untamed and eerie. Living in British Columbia for 6 years, I've heard the local legends about the Wendigo, a creature feared in these parts. As I stood there, mesmerized by the celestial display, I began to hear odd noises. It sounded like the snap of a twig coming from directly in front of me, maybe 100 yards away. At the time, I didn't pay much attention to it. However, after that night, I did some research and the pieces fell into place. The strange events that unfolded led me to believe that I might have encountered something far more terrifying than I initially thought. The sound was distant, but I remembered reading a story where someone mentioned that the further away a Wendigo's noises seem, the closer it actually is. Barely 10 seconds later, I heard strange sounds coming from the left side of my house, only about 50 feet away. Living in this area for years, I've become familiar with the usual nocturnal sounds like rabbits or coyotes, but this was different. It was a sound I'd never heard before, and it sent a wave of dread through me. A deep, primal fear took over, making me feel like something terrible was about to happen. Then, as abruptly as they began, the noises stopped, but the silence didn't last long. I began to hear faint voices where the sounds had come from. It sounded like a young girl, but the words were indistinguishable, quiet, faint, almost gibberish, but I was sure it was a female voice. Then, clear as day, twice as loud as before, I heard my name, Lucas, in the voice of a little girl coming from the same direction. At that moment, terror gripped me. I started walking back towards my front door, trying to rationalize what had just happened. I remembered reading that Wendigos are known to mimic human voices, especially those of people they've heard, to lure their prey. I also read that they often stalk around homes, waiting for the perfect moment. My heart was pounding as I reached the bottom of my driveway, heading for the safety of my front door. I heard the gravel crunch on my right side. The sound was heavy, deliberate, like footsteps, no more than 20 feet away. I couldn't see anything. It was too dark, and the steps were on the other side of my neighbor's car. Panic surged through me, but I resisted the urge to call out. Something in my gut told me that acknowledging whatever was out there would only make things worse. I tried to stay calm, even though every fiber of my being was screaming in terror. I was now at the top of the driveway, just a few feet from the door. The footsteps on both sides of me quickened, closing in. I ignored the sounds as best as I could, focusing on getting inside. I finally reached the door, flung it open, and locked it behind me, my hands shaking. But the fear didn't end there. That sense of dread clung to me. I secured the house, locked the back door, put the cover on the dog door, made sure all the windows were shut. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave. Everyone else was asleep, so I went to my sister's room, hoping she was awake. She wasn't, but in her sleep, she mumbled that I could come in. I sat on the floor, praying nothing else would happen. Of course, my sister's the only one who keeps her blinds up at night, and the screen on her window had fallen off weeks ago. It was just glass now, and I could see the entire backyard. If something was out there, it could see me too. I stayed in her room for about 15 minutes when suddenly, I heard faint whistling. It was soft, but it was coming from the backyard. The whistling grew louder and started to sound like a flute. My heart raced as I realized it might be related to the legends I'd read. Perhaps the flute of a Wendigo or some other malevolent spirit. That was it for me. I got up, told my sister goodnight, and left her room. I was too frightened to sleep, so I turned on some lights and sat at the kitchen bar. I even considered waking up my dad, just so I wouldn't be alone, but I decided against it. Then, I heard the gravel crunching again, this time from the backyard. Whatever it was close, only a few feet away from the back door. Then, a soft knock on the glass door. At first, I didn't register it, but it persisted. One knock every minute, steady and deliberate. My fear reached a new height. Something was on the other side of that door, and I wasn't about to find out what. I turned off the lights and headed to my room, not daring to look at the door. I stayed there for the rest of the night, too terrified to sleep. Even then, I could hear strange noises outside my window, but I forced myself to ignore them. The next morning, everything seemed normal, but the memory of that night still haunts me. I'm glad I trusted my instincts and didn't engage with whatever was out there. Who knows what could have happened if I hadn't? I have a small outbuilding next to my house, where I keep a TV and sometimes spend my evenings unwinding with a movie. One night, my partner was visiting, and we decided to watch a new release out in the shed. The setup there is pretty nice, so it's often more comfortable than watching in the house. I usually leave the back door open when I head out to the shed, especially since I live in a quiet, safe neighborhood with little worry about intruders. At the time, I had an elderly dog, a small mix of Pomeranian and Maltese, who was nearly deaf and blind. Her sight had almost completely gone, and she often wandered aimlessly around the house, likely due to dementia setting in. After the movie, we headed back inside. I went to the bathroom and noticed the usual sounds of my dog padding around the house were absent. Normally, she'd be roaming the rooms, but this time, there was nothing. My partner and I started searching the house, checking every corner, but she was nowhere to be found. It suddenly occurred to us that she might have somehow made her way outside through the open back door. To leave the house, she would have had to navigate from the hallway through my bedroom and then off a raised porch that stands about 4 to 5 feet above the ground. Given her blindness, it seemed impossible, but we decided to check outside just in case. We searched around the porch, expecting to find some sign of her, but there was nothing. No sign of a fall, no noises while we were in the shed, nothing at all. It was as if she had vanished. There's a small wooded area behind my house, and we thought she might have wandered into it. We began to explore the woods, shining our phone flashlights into the darkness. As we moved deeper, I suddenly heard the sound of leaves rustling nearby. Thinking it might be my dog, I pointed my flashlight toward the noise, but what I saw wasn't her. Instead, I saw a figure wearing a hood, standing about 15 or 20 feet away. They seemed to freeze as my light hit them. I quickly turned to my partner and whispered that someone was out here and we should head back. Just as I was about to move, I heard the leaves crunching again. When I shined my light back to where the figure had been, I was stunned. The figure had transformed, or at least it seemed like it, into a tall, thin, gray shape that bolted to the left, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. The sight sent chills through my entire body, from my head down to my toes. I was so frightened that I ran back to the house, almost forgetting my partner in my haste. When we were safely inside, I asked her what she had seen. She hadn't seen the figure, but she had heard the rapid rustling of leaves as if something was speeding through the woods. We never found my dog, nor any trace that she had even left the house. Despite searching every nook and cranny and putting up posts about her disappearance, she was never found. To this day, I wonder if what I saw that night was somehow connected to her disappearance. I can't help but overthink it, imagining that whatever that figure was might have entered my home while the door was open. I've never experienced anything like that since, but the memory of that night stays with me. I'm more cautious when I go out to the shed now, always feeling uneasy when I catch a glimpse of the woods out of the corner of my eye. The day after the incident, we even went back to the woods, searching for any sign of the strange figure or my dog, but found nothing. I still wish I knew what happened to her, but at least I know she's not suffering anymore. I'm from Kentucky, a place with lots of wooded areas where people love their guns, including me. I used to not believe that there was anything unknown in the woods. I thought maybe Bigfoot could be real, but I severely doubted it. After this happened, I know there is something out there that we don't understand. I had just bought my first AR-15 style rifle and got a 60-round drum magazine for it at Gander Mountain while they were going out of business, because why not? I read that the drum was amazing and rarely had any issues, and this will be important later. A few days after I got it, I finally decided to take it out for a test run and sight in my gun a little better. That's when everything went wrong. As I mentioned earlier, Kentucky is heavily wooded. 3/4 of the land I lived on was just thick woods. There was a main path for driving our gator and a few small paths our cows had made in the woods. I decided to walk along our creek, which had a small path half cleared by our cows. At the end of the path is a big field where our cows graze and where I sight in guns when the cows aren't there. As soon as I crossed the fence to go to the field, I instantly felt like I was being watched closely. I brushed it off because I've walked back there 1,000 times before and never been bothered by anything. So, I kept walking, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched, but I was still aware of it. The walk to the field along the creek is very short, maybe 2 minutes at a slow pace. The further I walked, the more intense the feeling got, like I was getting closer to whatever was watching me. About halfway there, the feeling became so intense that I couldn't ignore it anymore. The drum magazine I had with me was unloaded, so I stopped and started loading it. I only brought 20 rounds with me because I was just going to sight in my gun, and 20 should have been plenty. Now I'm stopped, paying extremely close attention to what's going on around me and loading my magazine. The exact moment I started putting rounds in the drum, I smelled something dead, like it had been rotting in the sun for a while. I started looking around, and right behind me was what was left of a possum. It was torn to pieces. It almost seemed like it had been placed there for me to find. The strange thing was that it looked like it had been dead for maybe a day at most, yet the smell seemed like it came from something far more decomposed. This obviously didn't sit well with me, so I hurried up with loading the magazine. I guess I should have taken the dead possum as a last chance to turn around. I decided to keep going. I had never had any problems back there before, so I assumed my brain was just being paranoid. I was almost to the field when I saw it. I was at the end of the creek, and the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Just as I was near the end of the creek and the edge of the woods, I heard a splash in the water. On edge, I immediately turned toward the noise, gun ready but no round in the chamber. Walking down the creek away from me was something I will never forget. It was at least 8 feet tall, probably taller, and very skinny. Imagine a grown man that weighs 120 pounds. Now stretch him out to be 8 feet tall, but his body width stays the same. It had very long arms and it walked on 2 legs. Its skin was stretched tightly across its body. It made no noise aside from the splash when it stepped in the creek as it walked. It also had a very weird walk which was almost like a waddle, but it was taking really large steps. That could have been because it was on a muddy creek bank. It was also a light brown color, almost like the color of a deer. Now I knew why I felt like I was being watched. My magazine was loaded, bolt ready to send a round in the chamber. Remember what I said about the magazine being extremely reliable? I pressed the bolt release on the gun to chamber a round, just in case this monstrous thing decided to attack. I did not intend on striking first. The round got stuck somehow and didn't even budge out of the magazine. I had never used that magazine before, so it didn't fail from heavy use. A bolt closing from a gun has enough force to break your finger, so why didn't this magazine work? My only guess is that thing had something to do with it. The magazine never worked right again, and I had to return it to Magpul. Needless to say, I didn't tell them this happened. I just told them the magazine failed several times. Anyway, back to the creature. The gun jammed on the first round, which is usually the easiest. The thing booked it out of there without running or making a noise. I had just long enough exposure to it to get the details I provided about it. As for what the creature was, my friend who knows more about this stuff than I do, and I have decided it could have been a Wendigo. The reason we think it was a Wendigo is because everything I described matches them near perfectly. I had read that they are incredibly thin and tall and have a stench of death that follows them everywhere. That likely explains the smell by the possum. They are also very fast, can be light brown in color, and they sometimes violently kill other animals to scare humans. The only thing we couldn't figure out was its behavior. Why am I still alive? Wendigos are supposed to be incredibly aggressive. Aside from watching me, it did nothing. It didn't try to attack or confront me. It ran from me like it was scared or trying to draw me where it wanted me. That being said, I have never had another encounter with it. I have gone to the same field, taking the same path, expecting to be watched, and have not felt that same intense feeling as I did that day. Something was out there, and you can't convince me otherwise. I've tried to trick myself into thinking I'm being watched out there, but it still doesn't compare to that day. I'm Indonesian, and I have a second-hand account about orang pendek to share. My grandpa was born in Sumatra, and even though his dad was a Chinese immigrant, my grandpa pretty much lived there his whole life. You see, the island of Sumatra has many thick and dense forests, and if I remember correctly, there are many parts still left unexplored. My grandpa was quite adventurous when he was younger. He often went into the forest with his friends to hunt squirrels and other small wild animals. One day, my grandpa and his friends decided to go to another region in Sumatra and hunt in a more remote and unfamiliar forest. He said he got bored hunting in the same forest all the time. So, accompanied by his usual hunting friends, they hired a local guide and entered the forest. After hunting squirrels all day, they realized they were lost. Their local guide said he'd never seen that part of the forest before, which was strange because he made sure to stay in the area he was familiar with. My grandpa said it felt like they were hypnotized by unseen forces, and before they knew it, they ended up in an unfamiliar part of the forest. They tried to remain calm and assess the situation, and that's when they noticed it. Something was observing them from behind the bushes. My grandpa said it looked like a hybrid between a human and a chimpanzee and was kind of small, about as tall as an adult's waist. He couldn't explain it well because of how strange the creature was, but he remembered one particular detail about it. Its front feet were in reverse position, so when the creature walked, it looked like it was walking backward. The creature noticed my grandpa's party, was aware of its presence, and walked away from the scene. Strangely enough, the creature didn't run at all. So out of curiosity, the party decided to follow it. They arrived at an open area where a herd of these creatures had gathered. My grandpa said they were speaking some kind of unknown language, like a wildman language. The party decided that they'd had enough curiosity and that it was time to get out of there because they were in an unknown situation and could be in real danger. After walking for hours, they miraculously reached the edge of the forest sometime after sunrise, and luckily, the creatures didn't follow them at all. It's up to you to believe me or not, but one thing I know for sure is that my grandpa wasn't a liar. He kept telling us this story even after he reached a very old age. This story got me into cryptozoology, and of course I did some research on orang pendek. Some testimonies from natives across Sumatra were similar to my grandpa's. My grandparents had a vacation cabin in the Jersey Pine Barrens, and every year over summer vacation, my parents would send me there to visit. I was living in Las Vegas at the time. The last time I was there, I was 8 years old in 1982. It was about 11 or so at night. My grandparents were in bed and I was reading Archie comic books by flashlight. Suddenly, I heard the most terrifying scream coming from outside. It scared me to my core because I had no idea what it was. I'd heard mountain lions and coyotes before, and this scream was definitely different. I quickly turned off the flashlight, and the cabin was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. Then I heard the scream again. This time, It sounded like it was right outside my bedroom window. I was absolutely terrified when I heard sniffing and snuffling noises just outside, followed by what sounded like pebbles being tossed or rolled on the roof. There was no way I was going to look outside, so I ran and woke up my grandpa. He saw the fear in my eyes, grabbed a light, and checked the perimeter of the cabin. He came back and said he couldn't see or hear anything. Needless to say, I slept in their bed that night. The next morning, we went outside to look under my window, and sure enough, we found hoof prints about the size of a fist coming from the woods right up to my window. At first, I thought it might have been a wild pig or something like that, but later, while playing on the other side of the house, I noticed a similar set of prints leading away from the house in almost an exact line from my bedroom window. When I got home, I told my dad about what happened and what we saw. He grew up around the Pine Barrens. He just casually said that it must have been the Jersey Devil. At the time, I had no idea what he was talking about, but I never forgot that incident. When I got a little older, I spent time in the library reading books about the Jersey Devil, and it sure sounds like that's what was outside my window that night. I never went back to Jersey to visit my grandparents while they still had that cabin. This happened to my son when he was 17 years old. We lived in New Mexico at the time. My son Cody was riding with his friends Drew and Alex. They were in Drew's truck with Drew driving. It was nighttime, and they were heading to Drew's house. Drew lived out in the country, so the road they were on was isolated and surrounded by desert. In fact, that whole area is flat and mostly dirt. As they were driving along, they saw a man standing in the middle of the road. Drew slowed down, and they all expected the man to move off to the side. The man didn't move. He just stood there. Drew slowed to a stop. The man was standing just outside the light from the headlights. He was wearing jeans and a long-sleeve shirt. They couldn't make out the features of his face, but they could tell he was facing them. For a few seconds, no one moved. The kids began to talk about going around him, but they weren't sure whether they should pass by him or turn around and find another way. Suddenly, the man dropped to all fours and started running toward the truck. All the kids started screaming as Drew slammed the truck into reverse and floored it. Now, they were going backward on this dark country road with the man chasing them on all fours, and he was keeping up with the truck. Drew sped up, and finally, the man dropped out of sight. Drew turned the truck around, and they all came back to our house. I was in the living room when they came running in, slammed and locked the door, and raced upstairs to Cody's room. I went up to see what was going on, and that's when they told me the story. I've never seen them so pale and frightened. They were completely shaken. This happened on a Friday night around 8 p.m. These were kids who normally would rather be anywhere except home on a weekend. That weekend, they stayed at our place the entire time. They didn't go out at all and only left because they had school on Monday. It took a month before they wanted to go out again at night. They would go anywhere during the day, but at night, they usually gathered at our house. Even to this day, if I bring up that night, Cody and his friends get really quiet and look scared. It took them a long time to get past it, and they still believe that talking about it might make it come back. As a former paramedic, I once responded with police and fire crews to a report of a person down by the railroad tracks. This was in a wooded area about 500 yards from the nearest access road. A railroad worker conducting a routine safety check had spotted the man. We all arrived, parked, and carried our equipment 500 yards to the scene. The man showed no signs of life. His EKG was flat and his pupils were fixed and dilated. After a thorough examination, we noted no visible signs of trauma. His body was still warm and rigor mortis hadn't set in, indicating he hadn't been deceased for too long. There were no signs of drug use, and the railroad worker confirmed that no trains had passed in the last 8 hours. We searched the area and discovered a makeshift campsite where the man had apparently been living. There were no medications or anything unusual at the site. We were close to an area rumored to be haunted and associated with occult activities. Despite the rumors, none of us had ever witnessed anything out of the ordinary. We waited for the funeral home to arrive and transport the body to the morgue for an autopsy as night fell. That's when strange things began happening. A few of us heard what sounded like distant whispering, though it seemed to come from no specific direction. Some of the guys thought we were playing tricks on them, but soon the whispering stopped. Instead, those who hadn't heard the whispers started hearing what sounded like children's laughter. It was coming from all around us with no clear source. Those who had heard the whispers never heard the laughter. This unsettling phenomenon lasted about 10 to 15 minutes while we stood near the body. The police on the scene urged the dispatcher to accelerate the funeral home's response. We quickly assisted in loading the body and left the area as swiftly as we could. We visited the morgue to discuss the cause of death with the coroner in the following afternoon. The first thing the coroner asked was why we had cleaned the body. My partner and I exchanged puzzled glances and asked him to clarify. He said the scene must have been very bloody, but we informed him there was no blood visible at the scene. The coroner grew pale and said that only added to the mystery, as the body had no blood in it whatsoever. There were no apparent marks where the blood could have been drained. He also mentioned experiencing something unusual during the autopsy, but declined to elaborate. The true cause of death remains a mystery to this day. One evening, I responded to a call about a suspicious individual at a house near my location. When I arrived, the homeowner described a strange encounter. Someone had knocked on his door, and when he opened it, he saw a woman standing in his driveway holding a grotesque child-sized doll with horns. The doll was covered in what looked like blood and cuts. The bewildered homeowner asked the woman what she wanted. She turned to face him and said that the doll needed food. She then let out a terrifying scream and charged toward him. Naturally, he slammed the door shut and called for help. When I got to the scene, there were clear scratch marks on the door and a significant amount of blood, presumably from the woman's fingers. I called for a search to begin, so a couple of units came to patrol the area while I conducted a foot search. Not long after, we received a report that the woman had returned to the house, but she was in the backyard this time. I hurried back and entered the backyard with a flashlight in hand. The area was dark, but I spotted the woman huddled in a corner beside the eerie doll. I approached and asked if she was all right, but she remained silent. As one of the patrol units arrived, their headlights illuminated her figure. This revealed her disheveled appearance. She had long tangled black hair and tattered clothes. She had no shoes, and she looked like she had been living rough. She was murmuring something to the doll, but her words were indecipherable. My partner and I tried to communicate with her, but she continued whispering and was unresponsive to our attempts. Deciding to remove her from the scene, we reached out to restrain her. The moment we touched her, she erupted into violent resistance. She was punching and kicking us, and she was flailing in all directions. Despite our efforts, she was incredibly strong and difficult to subdue. During the struggle, she managed to break free and assumed a crouched position. Her head tilted unnaturally as she emitted a chilling growl. Suddenly, she let out a piercing scream and charged at us. To protect ourselves, my partner delivered a direct punch to her face and knocked her out cold. We quickly handcuffed her and transported her to the hospital, where she tested positive for PCP and various opiates. She faced charges of assaulting an officer, resisting arrest, and trespassing. It was reported that she was institutionalized due to a severe mental health disorder, though the specifics were not disclosed to us. My sister is a police officer, and she shared this story with me that I can't seem to forget. It will stick with me forever. She was responding to a domestic disturbance in a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of Chicago. Neighbors reported loud screaming and banging on the second floor for over an hour before everything went silent. Being a rough neighborhood, they didn't call until they noticed a terrible smell. So my sister and her partner approached the door, knocked, and got no response except for a faint whimpering. Finding the door unlocked, they entered. The living room was in disarray with furniture overturned. The TV was shattered and there were several holes punched in the walls. So far it seemed like a typical domestic situation, but they had to clear the apartment as there were reports of 2 people involved, and so far they had found no one. They moved to the bedroom and turned the handle. Instead of the door swinging open, my sister ended up pushing against it with her shoulder because something was blocking it. At this point, she had an idea of what to expect, so she gave her partner a knowing look and shoved the door open. A dog scurried out, its white fur stained with red. Behind the door lay the woman involved in the argument. She was slumped against it, half-seated. She was barely recognizable as a piece of the bed frame had been used to bludgeon her repeatedly. They surveyed the room and found bloody handprints everywhere, originating from the bed and tracing a chaotic path around the room. Smears of blood and handprints covered the window and its locks, which are evidence of her desperate attempts to escape and scream for help. A few broken fingernails lay on the sill and the floor below. The window had been nailed shut, which is a common precaution in such a neighborhood, so it was impossible to open. The handprints circled the room along with several face prints from where her head had been smashed against the walls. All of it was leading to her final resting place beside the door. There were bite marks on her face where the dog, driven by hunger, had started to eat the remains after the brutal attack. The attacker was never caught. Investigation revealed that it was a live-in boyfriend who had been supplying her with drugs. The dog was taken to a shelter and eventually found a loving home. Many years ago, we received a call to assist the sheriff's office with a burglary in progress out in the county. Our radios couldn't communicate with their radios, so their dispatch telephoned ours, who then relayed the details to us. This left us with minimal information and no clear destination, so I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling crawling up my spine as I sped through the dark. It took us about 30 minutes to reach the scene. The house was shrouded in darkness. We soon discovered that the suspect had cut the power supply days earlier and had been living in the house while the family of 4 was away on vacation. As we approached the front door, I heard a man's voice shouting,
"Please leave my house."
I entered with caution and found a young man who appeared mentally unstable. He was covered in dirt with an unkempt beard and wild eyes. He was muttering loudly and rapidly, and he's not making any sense.
"I was sent. I'm supposed to be here. This is the place. This is the promised place. You'll be sorry."
He was not responsive to any of our questions and commands. Thankfully, he did not resist when I put handcuffs on him. It was as if he was staring right through me while I questioned him and searched his backpack. I felt a deep unease despite being much larger than him. I didn't even want to put him in the back of my car, fearing what he might do. His backpack was filled with strange items, including a hunting knife, clothes that didn't fit him, mail with various addresses and names, and a children's math book. He also had a notebook with incoherent writing and drawings of strange creatures. It was all just bizarre. A county deputy eventually arrived and took him away, and I never heard anything more about the incident. I'm a military police officer, so I've had experience in both law enforcement and corrections. In corrections, our main office also served as the police services desk. I remember that the phone would ring often with no one on the other end. My fellow officers told me that these are just normal and there's nothing to worry about. One time, the phone office rang, and instead of a number, it displayed a descriptor that I don't remember exactly. It was something like emergency phone number 12. Being new, I immediately contacted my superiors about it. They told me to drop it and never report such calls again. It's pretty eerie, right? Anyway, a few years have passed after that. I was on patrol and I was dispatched to an abandoned part of the base in response to an emergency phone call. There was no specific location given to me because the dispatcher was new to the base, and they didn't know where emergency phone 12 exactly was. They also had not received the memo not to report such calls. The dispatcher mentioned that the caller sounded frantic and claimed they were being chased. This meant someone had actually been on the other end of the line. After some digging, the dispatcher found old maps and relayed the information to me and my partner. We rushed to the site. When we arrived, there was no phone or radio on site. It's just a broken pole where one had once been. That was an interesting one to report. I've had a few unsettling moments in my career as a cop, but one has always stood out to me. It was a call I had when I worked the graveyard shift at around 2 a.m. in the dead of winter. The air was freezing that night, and we received a call from dispatch about an open call with a woman faintly whispering, "Help me," before the line went silent. My partner and I arrived at the apartment to find the door slightly ajar. We braced ourselves for the worst as we saw a blood smear on it. The inside was pitch black and eerily quiet. We proceeded with caution. Felt like stepping into a horror movie. The first thing that caught our attention was a large arterial spray on the wall, which then smeared down a hallway and disappeared towards the back of the apartment. As we made our way down the hall, blood was smeared along the walls leading to a bedroom. The door handle was covered in blood. We opened the door and saw a motionless figure on the bed. Blood was covering both the bed and the body. The silence in the apartment was unnerving, and it's almost unbelievable that all the blood came from just one person. We checked the body and found a faint pulse. The woman was still alive. Turned out she was blind and had other health issues. She had a shunt in her arm which she had accidentally pulled out, and that caused her to bleed profusely. For those wondering, she survived the incident. Though it happened more than 10 years ago, I still remember the chilling, quiet, and stale atmosphere of the apartment on that bitterly cold night. My friend is a police officer in a major Canadian city. One night, we had plans to go out after his shift. He decided to pick me up in his patrol car since he was nearly done with his shift and just needed to return the car to the depot. On the way, he got a call about someone hearing strange noises coming from their basement, noises that sounded like a person. He figured he'd make this his last stop and asked me to wait in the car while he talked with the homeowner and checked it out. He was gone for about half an hour and returned with a look of astonishment and fear on his face. Apparently, the homeowner had been hearing loud thuds from his basement for a few weeks, but that day they were particularly loud and frightening. Thinking someone might have broken in, the homeowner called the police. My friend went down to the basement with the homeowner. The basement was completely dark, and the lights had to be turned on from the electrical panel. As they reached the panel, my friend said he saw something out of the corner of his eye. At the end of a hallway that led to a cold storage room, he saw a man standing there and facing the door of the cold storage. He shouted at the man to turn around, but the figure didn't move. The homeowner saw him too and was terrified. My friend asked the man to turn around once more before flipping the switch for the lights. The instant the lights came on, the figure vanished. My friend swore he searched every inch of that basement but found no one there. The homeowner was visibly shaken and decided to stay with a friend for the night. My friend called for another officer to keep an eye on the house to see if anyone tried to enter the property again. I'm not sure what happened after that, but my friend is adamant he saw someone in that basement. I've had my share of unsettling experiences, from sensing a mere presence to witnessing full apparitions. Sometimes I'd hear whispers, other times a heavy silence would fill the room. But the figure with the mask was in a realm of its own, a terrifying encounter like no other. It began when I was startled awake by a low, rumbling laugh. By then, I was all too familiar with the suffocating sensation of sleep paralysis and immediately recognized the feeling. I prepared myself for another night of eerie wakefulness when, to my horror, the door creaked open. A figure entered, wearing a mask as crimson as freshly spilled blood. The mask had a fiendish appearance, with tusk-like fangs protruding upwards, its cheeks contorted into grotesque shapes, and a furrowed brow that seemed to deepen with every moment. But what disturbed me the most were the eyes. They were an unnatural shade of violet, serpentine and bulging, as if ready to burst from their sockets. The figure was draped in a rich, deep brown cloak, the hood drawn low, casting a shadow over the rest of his face, making the mask and those terrible eyes the focal point. He dragged a writhing burlap sack behind him and stopped at the foot of my bed, his gaze locked onto mine, and after what felt like an eternity, he reached into the sack. One by one, he pulled out the faces of everyone I had ever loved or cared for. Each time, he positioned them so I was forced to look into their eyes. With a twisted, bony hand, skin stretched so tight it seemed ready to tear, he traced a long, sharp nail across their throats, spilling streams of blood at my feet. I was helpless, watching the life drain from the eyes of everyone I had ever known. In their gazes, I saw a chilling blend of terror and sorrow. When the sack was finally empty, he dropped it carelessly and began to circle my bed. He paused as he loomed over me, leaning down to gently stroke my cheek with his blood-stained nail. Then, with his other hand, he slowly removed his mask. Words fail to capture what lay beneath that mask. A face that constantly shifted, contorted, and transformed into ever more grotesque and horrifying forms, each more terrifying than the last. As I stared into those serpentine eyes, he spoke to me. The words are etched into my memory, but they were so deeply disturbing and personal that I won't repeat them. Yet, the final thing he said still echoes in my mind. Cherish the time you have left, for soon your life will be mine, and your soul as well. And as he spoke those words, his face settled into a final, chilling form. My own. I experienced a number of unsettling sleep disturbances in the late 80s and early 90s. As I remember, they began during my college years when I would occasionally take naps between classes. I figured at the time that they were triggered by light filtering through my eyelids, rousing part of my brain while leaving the rest in a fog. One of my earliest experiences occurred on a Saturday afternoon. I had returned from the campus cafeteria to my dorm room and soon drifted off to sleep. I was alone in the room, and before falling asleep, I could hear people in the hallway. Someone had brought a cat into the dorm, which was quite unusual. I dozed off, but when I thought I had woken up, I found myself completely unable to move. I was convinced the cat, which I hadn't seen or heard directly, but only heard others mention outside my door, was lurking just beyond my vision, ready to pounce. Despite my efforts, I couldn't move a muscle. Then, somehow, I fully awoke and reality snapped back into place. Of course, there was no cat in the room. These episodes continued sporadically over the next several years. The last one I recall was by far the most frightening and happened about 5 or 6 years after the one with the cat. By then, I was living in Texas but had returned to my home state for a visit, staying at a friend's house. One morning, while my friend was in the shower, I thought I had woken up but couldn't move, and I distinctly heard 2 voices. They sounded sinister to me at the time, speaking about me in harsh, threatening tones. I couldn't see them, but I could feel their presence, and it was terrifying. I desperately tried to call out to my friend, but no sound would come out. Then, I snapped awake, and the voices vanished, leaving only the sound of running water from the shower. During one of the most troubling periods of my life, I woke up in my room with an overwhelming sensation of pressure and a deep sense of malevolence. It might sound like a cliché, but the air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if some dark presence was lingering nearby. Although it was the middle of the afternoon and the room was well lit, the feeling was unmistakable. I found myself in that strange state where my mind was fully awake, my eyes were open, but my body was frozen in paralysis. I stared at the entrance to my room, gripped by fear, for what seemed like an eternity. Then it appeared. A figure began to slowly stagger through the doorway. A frail, ancient woman with hollow eyes, long gray hair, and a skeletal frame. Her skin clung loosely to her bones, and she was completely unclothed, with sunken ribs that made her appearance all the more unsettling. As she moved clumsily toward me, I was overwhelmed by a profound sense of dread. There was an unmistakable sense of something deeply unsettling about her presence. With every step she took, I felt as though she was trying to draw closer to me in a way that felt disturbingly intimate. It took every ounce of strength and willpower I had to force myself out of this nightmarish state as she drew nearer, almost hovering above me. It was like something out of a horror film, reminiscent of the way the Dementors in Harry Potter were portrayed years later, draining the very life from their victims. I struggled to break free, and with great effort, I managed to let out a yell that began as a faint whimper before finally becoming a desperate roar. As I regained control of my body, the woman vanished. The transition was seamless. Everything else in the room remained unchanged, except for the lingering feeling of dread, which slowly faded away. I was deeply shaken, wondering if I had merely lost the ability to perceive whatever had been there once I was fully awake. In an attempt to shake off the vile sensation that clung to me, I took a cold shower, hoping to cleanse myself of the lingering unease. Since then, I've done a considerable amount of research into out-of-body experiences and have come to believe that during our darkest moments, there are entities that are drawn to us. I was astonished to discover that the phenomenon of the night hag or nightmare is not uncommon. Whether these beings truly exist is a question with many possible answers. My advice to anyone who is tormented by such experiences is not to underestimate the power of ritual and personal resolve. I've experienced sleep paralysis since childhood, and like many families without scientific knowledge of the condition, I was exposed to all sorts of explanations, demonic possession being the most frightening of them all. When I turned 14 and started exploring information on the internet, I discovered that this was a fairly common experience for people with overactive imaginations or those dealing with high levels of anxiety and stress. So, I said goodbye to fear and welcomed a new perspective. As a kid, I often felt a sense of unease, as if someone was watching me. There was the familiar weight pressing down on my chest and, occasionally, the unsettling sight of shadows in the room. Although these episodes were frightening, they were relatively mild. Not too long ago, I was working on a project with a tight deadline. I finally went to bed at 3 a.m., knowing I'd have to wake up by 5 a.m. to continue working. My mind was still racing, though my body was utterly exhausted and tense. I was fully aware that I might have another episode of sleep paralysis since I had become quite adept at recognizing the signs. However, I also knew how to manage it, so I wasn't too concerned. Then it happened. I was in my room but couldn't move. I slowed my breathing and tried to focus on something else. Suddenly, I began hearing voices, whispers and mumblings with startling clarity. Then, I felt the bed shift as if someone had sat down. I could feel fingers slowly tracing from my bare leg up my side, finally stopping at my cheek. It was a slow, deliberate, and firm caress. All the while, the voices grew louder, and I lay there, unable to turn my head and see what was on the bed with me. I woke up in a state of utter terror and looked at the clock. Only 20 minutes had passed. I wasn't alarmed by the voices or the sensation of being touched, but by the fact that I had never experienced auditory hallucinations or the distinct feeling of something solid touching me during an episode of sleep paralysis. I'd had vivid dreams before where I could taste, smell, feel pain, and more, but nothing like this had ever happened during sleep paralysis. I was terrified that I might have been awake and experiencing the onset of something far more serious, like schizophrenia. It shook me to my core. One evening, as I was drifting off to sleep, something strange happened. My arm seemed to slip through the bed. Of course, my physical arm remained on the mattress, but the sensation was unmistakable. Normally, when this occurs, I just lift my arm back up, but this time curiosity got the better of me. How long would this sensation last? I began moving my arm around experimentally, and soon enough, my shoulder started to sink through as well. This was new and it was thrilling. I wiggled my fingers, then swung my arm about more energetically, feeling emboldened by this peculiar experience. Deciding to push the limits, I deliberately tried to lower my head through the bed. To my surprise, it worked, but what I encountered was nothingness. Not darkness, but an actual absence of anything. It's hard to describe, but it was as if nothing itself existed in that space. I know this probably sounds absurd, yet I sensed there was something out there, further away. With fear nowhere to be found and my curiosity uncontrollable, I decided to reach out for whatever it was. That was a big mistake. My leg began to slip, then my torso followed. My other arm went next, and soon my hips were sliding in two. Just as my left leg was about to go, I suddenly realized that whatever I was reaching for wasn't something I wanted to engage with. Panic set in, a terror as intense as the fury I sometimes feel during sleep paralysis. It was a fear unlike anything I'd ever known. I tried to pull back, but I was powerless. I attempted to kick my leg up to anchor myself, but it felt as though I was being pulled into a void. My other knee slipped, leaving only my foot and part of my left hip keeping me from completely disappearing. I was convinced I was about to be lost, whatever that might mean, but just when I thought it was over, something grasped my shoulder and pulled me back with incredible force, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The hand felt solid, strong, like it belonged there. It yanked me up as if I weighed nothing at all, and I slammed back into my body with a sense of finality. It was as if the universe itself declared, "There's no way I'm letting you fall into that." My first experience of sleep paralysis was in junior high. I am 30 now, and it has continued to sporadically occur throughout my life. Worst experience I've ever had happened after I graduated high school and moved into my grandfather's old house after he passed. I had a couple of roommates who were out, and I decided to take an afternoon nap. I knew as soon as I shut my eyes what was going to happen, but I never could have imagined how intense it would be. The music I had playing in the background began to morph until it was nothing but the sound of unknown voices screaming and crying in pain. I had fallen asleep on my side, facing a pair of doors leading into my walk-in closet. The doors slowly began to creak open and give me a glimpse of complete darkness surrounding a pair of ruby eyes staring gleefully at me. As the doors continued to open inch by inch, the piercing cries intensified, and I was able to pick out the word hell being repeatedly screamed. I managed to jerk myself out of it just before the doors opened halfway, and I wasted no time bolting out of bed to the safety of my front yard. Feeling the sun on my skin and seeing the neighbors' kids playing in the street had never felt so good. This started in the winter of 2012. I was 23 years old at the time and living with my dad. My mom and my brother were living in another house about 10 minutes away from us. One morning, I woke up around 8 a.m. because I had an early doctor's appointment. I went outside to see a note pinned to the windshield wiper of our car. The note said, "I'm going to kill you, pedophile scum." I kind of just laughed it off. I assumed the note was for my dad, who had a habit of complaining to parents in our neighborhood about their children's shitty behavior. For some background, there were these twin boys who liked to try and catch and torture squirrels. He often marched them home by the ears to complain about them to their parents. I thought one of the parents was just being a douchebag, so my dad and I didn't bother with it too much. Later in the day, while talking to my mom on the phone, I mentioned the note to her offhandedly in a very casual way, and I was shocked by her response. She responded by very emphatically warning me several times to make sure all of my windows and doors were locked and to bring a weapon to bed with me at night. I was a bit taken aback because she'd never said anything to me like that before. She'd never even given me the good touch, bad touch talk. She reminded me at least 12 times over the course of the conversation to bring a knife or a baseball bat to bed with me and to lock my bedroom door at night. I thought she was just overreacting, so I waved her off. Then other weird things started happening. We started getting random packages and deliveries sent to our house. There were Bibles and Qurans, newspapers, porn flyers, pizzas, and moving trucks that we hadn't ordered. The first few times it happened, I thought it was a mistake, but as it kept happening, I came to the conclusion that somebody must be pulling a prank on us. We didn't know who it was, so there was nothing we could really do about it but apologize profusely to yet another confused pizza delivery man. In September of that year, I started taking a night school class with my best friend. The course went from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. every Monday and Wednesday night. After class, his mom would pick us up and drive us home. Sometime in November, his mom dropped me off from school and I went inside and chilled on the couch for a couple of hours. I like to wind down before I go to bed a bit or I can't sleep. I ended up falling asleep on the couch. Something woke me up abruptly at about 4 in the morning. I heard the unmistakable sound of a car tire being slashed, and it sounded like our car. What the hell was going on? We didn't have any enemies. In retrospect, this was probably a stupid thing to do, especially considering that I'm a relatively small female. I'm only 5'5" and I was 23 at the time, but I grabbed a generic kitchen knife and went outside to check it out. When I got outside, I discovered immediately that I was correct. There was a man in our driveway slashing our car tires. Unwisely, I immediately yelled and he turned around to face me. That was when I noticed what he was slashing our tires with. It was an enormous hunting knife, at least 6 inches long. He looked surprised but then defiant, and he began to advance towards me with the knife slightly raised. I just froze. I didn't know what to do. He was coming at me so fast that I couldn't even think. Thankfully, at that exact second, my across-the-street neighbor who had also heard him slashing our tires turned on his porch light and yelled out the window that they were calling the cops. The man yelled back that he didn't care, but he quickly retreated back to his car, where I could see a middle-aged woman with long brown hair waiting for him in the passenger seat. Our eyes locked and I knew instantly that we had met before, but I couldn't quite put my finger on when or where. I just knew in my gut that I had met this woman before. They sped off into the night and we called the cops, who said they couldn't do anything for us because they didn't know who had done it. I mean, isn't that kind of their job? I called my mom to tell her what happened and to ask her if she had any idea who would have done this to us. She immediately said no, but there was something in her voice. I could just tell that she wasn't being honest. A few weeks later, I decided to go to my mom's house to spend a day or two there. I was determined to get some answers. As soon as I walked in the front door, I knew something was wrong. The second she saw me, she just started bawling her eyes out. She took me by the hand and sat me on the couch. She then explained the whole story to me from start to finish. It's necessary for me to give a little bit of background information here. My mother is a businesswoman by trade and was still in sales at the time, but she's also a bit of a hippy-dippy type. She believes in astrology, reincarnation, and other similar stuff. In addition to her regular day job, she was also selling an all-natural brand of makeup that is free of parabens, oils, sulfates, and other common cosmetic additives. A couple of months before this all started, she had ended up being referred a new client named Andrea by her weed dealer. Yes, my mom smokes weed. We live in Canada and everyone smokes here. Andrea was her dealer's girlfriend and she was interested in buying makeup. So my mom invited her over to her apartment to look at some makeup samples. They started chatting a bit about a variety of topics and my mom let it slip her last name. As my mom told me, Andrea had paused for a few seconds and just looked at her. And then she asked if my mom is married to a man named Darren. My mom answered yes, Darren is my father and was her ex-husband. And then shockingly, this Andrea woman had actually burst into tears and threw her arms around my mom in a hug. She began to tell her this horrific story about all the disgusting things that my dad had done to her. Andrea is in her mid-30s now. Apparently, when she was 14 years old, she had been dating a man named Andrew. He happened to be living with my dad at the time after my parents' divorce. This would have happened around 1994, and I was about 4 years old at the time. According to Andrea, her boyfriend Andrew and my father had taken turns beating her and sexually abusing her. They would force her to do sex work in order to make money off of her, and she had never recovered from this. At this point, I realized that this was where I'd recognized her from. My dad had been roommates with her boyfriend Andrew, and I used to see all three of them when I went over there to visit him every second weekend. She sobbed inconsolably during the whole retelling of this story, telling my mother how after this traumatic experience she had turned to drugs and alcohol to numb the pain of her abuse. She also said that she'd been addicted to crack and alcohol off and on ever since because of what my father had done to her. My mom was shocked and she didn't know what to do. On one hand, she knew my father to be a generous, soft-spoken, and kind person who had never lifted a finger to her or any other person. He rarely raised his voice. But on the other hand, it seemed odd that Andrea would just happen to remember his name all these years later if she had been lying. She didn't know who to believe. After several hours of crying and much consoling on my mother's part, Andrea finally left. That was when the stalking began. A few days after this encounter, my mother came home from work to find Andrea's boyfriend sitting on her couch waiting for her. He immediately told her that he was planning on taking revenge on my dad. He said my dad deserved to die because he was an evil scum. If my mom told anybody at all, especially the cops, he said he would be sure to kill me as well. He then concluded his threat by describing the layout of our living room and exactly what outfit I was wearing that day. From then on, he or Andrea would text or call her several times a day to threaten and taunt my mother. They would tell her that they were going to call the cops on my dad and have him thrown in prison. They said they were going to have him killed and that if she told anybody, they would hire somebody to murder me. Naturally, my mother was absolutely terrified. She was from an upper-middle-class family who had immigrated to Canada from Germany, and she had never dealt with this type of person before. She stopped eating, she couldn't sleep, and she even stopped going to work. She lost 30 pounds, and her hair started falling out from stress. She started having panic attacks because she didn't know what to do. Later on, she told me that she understood how I felt now because I have an anxiety disorder that causes me to experience panic attacks. Eventually, after the night I almost got stabbed, she decided that she had to call the cops. She couldn't take the chance that they would hurt me. She had to do something about it, and what she found out was shocking. Andrea was well known to the police. When my mom told them this story, she was so well known that they weren't even surprised to hear her story. In fact, they told her Andrea had done this exact thing to at least a dozen other men. She would meet and blackmail men into giving her money, gadgets, drugs, and other things, threatening to call the cops and report them for rape if they didn't. As it turned out, her boyfriend was a dealer of drugs other than just weed, and he would often use his drug connections to intimidate and extort the men. For some twisted reason, he never questioned Andrea's stories of being abused and enslaved by all of these different men. Maybe he genuinely believed that she was telling the truth. It happened that Andrea remembered my father's name because he was roommates with her ex back then. That made us her next target. After some time, Andrea would get arrested on a possession and drug distribution charge. She'd attempt to make deals with the police by offering them information about criminals and sexual offenders in exchange for less time in prison. She eventually did this so many times that the police stopped believing her. After my mom called the cops, the whole story came undone. Andrea and her boyfriend haven't bothered us since, thankfully. It's been a while since the whole thing happened, and I'm still terrified to leave the curtains open at nighttime in case somebody's watching me. I don't think I'll ever be able to feel fully safe in this house ever again. This happened a long time ago when I was in high school. My mom just recently found the paperwork about it when she cleaned out her office upon retiring from the police department. I remember being upset and scared when it happened, but reading the details as an adult, it sounded even worse than I remembered. I am female and I was 17 working at a flower and gift shop at the time. It's nighttime and a man comes in. He was short, overweight, balding, in his 40s, and gave off a creepy vibe. He tells me about how he needs an apology gift for his girlfriend, so I offer a bouquet, obviously. He says she doesn't like flowers because they die. This was the first weird thing as he came into a flower shop. Then he goes into detail about how he hit her and asks me if I think he was right to do so. This was long ago, so I don't remember exactly what I answered, but I think it was something along the lines of not if you want her to continue being your girlfriend. He then tells me what a great job I'm doing and asks when I get off of work. I dodge answering and he leaves. There was nothing for 6 months after that. Then right before Valentine's Day, he walks in the door 1 minute before I closed shop. It was dark, and from the outside, it looked like I was working alone as my coworker was in the bathroom. She's a 40-year-old female, by the way. Instinctively, it felt like a predator had just entered the room. You know when something isn't right and everything felt not right. I then notice he has a tarnished revolver tucked into the front of his windbreaker, which is halfway unzipped. It was obvious he wanted it seen. I quickly scribbled a note to my coworker that said he has a gun and handed it to her when she came out of the bathroom. She calmly walked to the phone and looked at me, wordlessly asking if she should call the cops. I shook my head no, as I felt like it would escalate the situation. God forbid he heard the police coming and took us hostage or something. I was just going to try and act as calm and normal as I could, and hopefully not tip the situation into something more dangerous. He spends 15 minutes wandering around what was a fairly small shop. In retrospect, he was probably waiting to see if my coworker would leave, as it was now well past closing. Finally, he places an order for pickup on Valentine's Day, which gives me his name and details for the police report I'm sure as hell about to file. He buys a card and pulls out a wad of $100 bills. He slowly thumbs through them as though looking for the right one with which to pay for his $40 order. I ask him if he wants a bag, as it wouldn't be very inconspicuous if he just showed up at home with the Valentine's card. He replies, no. I didn't feel like being inconspicuous tonight. That seemed like an obvious reference to the gun hanging out of his coat. He leaves and we quickly lock the door and watch him sit in his truck outside. We were not about to exit the shop until he was gone. Finally, he pulls out of his parking spot and just moves to another spot further away. He continues to just sit there. I don't know how long we waited, but he finally left. I called my mom crying. She called the police, who came to the shop the next day to take a report. I told my best friend at the time what happened, and she told her mother. Her mother happened to work with the same creepy man and informed security at her job. She said he was very weird and liked to talk about weapons a lot. The security at their company, which is a large business that deals with government tech and security contracts, pulled him into their office and questioned him about it. The man claimed it was a glove in his pocket and not a revolver. The police were definitely pissed that his company made contact with him about it before they did, as he successfully dodged the cops' multiple calls and visits to his apartment. My mom, much to my teen fury at the time, made me quit my job. It was devastating, as I loved it there. In retrospect, it seems to be the right call. The dude came in on Valentine's Day and picked up his order. Thankfully, I never saw him again. I use Tinder pretty frequently, and it's usually a good experience. So I match with this guy named Charlie, and he seems pretty cool. He's really cute and into music, which is appealing since I also sing and play piano. We chat for a bit, and eventually, I agree to meet him at his place. In hindsight, meeting a stranger at their home was probably my first mistake. Since I don't drive, I take an Uber to his place, which is a bit far and ends up being quite pricey. When he buzzes me into the apartment complex, I get this unsettling feeling but brush it off as nerves. I go up to the 3rd floor where he's waiting at the door. Everything seems fine initially. We chill, smoke a couple of bowls, and watch a movie. Then he makes a move and I go along with it. We end up on the bed, getting intimate, when suddenly he wraps his hands around my neck and starts squeezing really hard. Now, I don't mind this kind of thing in the right setting, but alone in a stranger's house without any prior discussion is not one of those settings. I literally can't breathe and feel like I'm turning blue. He's relentless, yelling at me with this wild look in his eyes, asking if I'm scared. And yes, I am absolutely terrified because it feels like he's trying to kill me. I struggle and finally manage to wriggle out of his grasp and start screaming. He's telling me to calm down while I'm frantically trying to get dressed. He grabs my wrist as I try to leave, but I use all my strength to pull away and slam the door behind me. As it closes, he hurls a nasty insult at me. When I get home, I look in the mirror and see bruises all over my neck. I try to cover them up with makeup, but it's clear that I look like someone who has just been through a terrifying ordeal. Later, he texts me something crude and offensive, implying that I can take on two guys at the same time. I can't believe his nerve and block him immediately, reporting him on Tinder. I wish I could have done more because I genuinely believe he could have killed me. I've been debating going to the police, but the bruises are gone now, and it's a case of his word against mine. Still, I'm seriously considering it because the next person might not be as lucky as I was. I'm a psychiatric nurse. Early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. There was a resident I'll call Jameson Clark. He was an elective mute, which simply means that he wouldn't or couldn't talk, but there were no pathological findings as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and in fact seemed quite normal back then. There's just this notable exception of being close to 7 feet tall, which is definitely above average. He'd been raised in the rural Midwest and joined the military when he was 19. He was stationed somewhere in the West after boot camp, and he just inexplicably vanished one night. It was declared an AWOL for years, and finally, he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Northeast. He approached the desk and said to the receptionist, "My name is Jameson Clark, and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him via fingerprints, I guess. He was well-fed and in good health except for his refusal to speak. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man, and that whoever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They said he was a ghost and a stand-in for their dead relative and demanded not to be contacted again. Jameson paced all day every day, not in a frantic way, but just lumbering up and down the halls and outside. He smiled all the time and would be moving his mouth in a way that indicated talking or muttering, but he was dead silent. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he were laughing heartily, although not even a breath could be heard. If he's told to go to the dining room for a meal, he'd go and eat. But if nobody told him, he just kept pacing and never indicating hunger. When offered a cigarette, he'd smoke it in an oddly formal way, like almost delicately, if that makes sense. But he never seemed to crave smoking. The man wanted nothing. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. There was nothing to do for this man. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Jameson would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. Eventually, I got a better job somewhere else and I resigned. On my last day there, the last thing I saw was Jameson, who was pacing in the parking lot. He was throwing his head back to laugh without a sound. I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. I worked as a hospital transporter for a couple of years. The transport home base was in the basement where all the laundry was done and supplies were sorted. After one particular incident, I dreaded working late nights. I was alone in the basement one evening when I heard whistling near the elevator at the end of the hallway. Expecting to see my coworker on duty, I poked my head around the corner, but no one was there. I shrugged it off as I'm not easily spooked. With the night being slow, I had some snacks and relaxed in the break room for a while. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang. When I went into the hallway, I saw a bed rolling down and bumping into the sides. I radioed my coworker thinking he was just playing a prank, but he replied that he was upstairs in the cafeteria. I was still skeptical, so I thought I'd catch him in the act. As I walked past the laundry room, the machine started running. Expecting to find him there, I popped my head in, but it was completely empty. Now I started to get a little nervous. I stepped into the laundry room and the machine stopped abruptly. I froze, then bolted out and headed toward the elevator when I heard the whistling again. I was certain I was the only worker in the basement. While waiting for the elevator, I watched in disbelief as things began falling off the shelves down the hall. The boxes of gloves, tissues, and packages of tubes were all falling one by one at the opposite end. My entire body broke out in goosebumps, my hairs stood on end, and I had a strong gut feeling I was being watched. As I stepped into the elevator, I felt what seemed like someone brushing my arm. I rushed upstairs and found my coworker in the cafeteria, where I freaked out to him about what had happened. I left that place and transferred soon after. The eeriest part of it all is that I usually whistle mindlessly to myself at work. It's almost as if whatever that was mimicking me. It was the creepiest feeling ever. During my training years as a psychiatrist, I spent 6 months working in a ward dedicated to treating patients with depressive and anxiety disorders. The ward was housed in an old building that had been serving psychiatric patients since the mid-1920s. Our floor had 13 beds, a nurse's station, a living room, and a few conference rooms. A few weeks into my stint, I was interviewing a patient who mentioned that she heard a baby crying at night, which disturbed her sleep. Given that our hospital was isolated from residential areas and had strict visiting hours, there were no babies around. After the interview, a nurse pulled me aside and seriously mentioned that the baby crying wasn't a psychotic symptom. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press further. It didn't affect the patient's diagnosis or treatment, so I soon forgot about it. About 3 months into my time there, I was sitting at the nurse's station while 3 nurses behind me chatted. One remarked that she's very active today, and another replied that they hadn't really noticed. I'd asked whom they were talking about. They exchanged glances, and one hesitantly told me, "Well, there's a baby here. She cries sometimes." I was skeptical, but before I could respond, I heard it. There's a distant yet clear baby's cry, as if it were coming from behind 2 or 3 walls. I was perplexed as I looked at the nurses, who gave me a knowing look. I questioned them further, but they had no more information. They just confirmed that this faint baby cry had always been there. I heard it 2 or 3 times a week over the next few months. I mentioned it to a new doctor, who laughed it off, but a few weeks later, she came to me. She was looking pale and admitted she heard it during her coffee break. All the nurses seemed aware of it, but in psychiatry, hearing such things isn't something to boast about. When I was transferred, I never heard the crying again. I think about it sometimes, but I still don't know what to make of it. I'm part of an on-call crisis response team, so I often find myself at the hospital during odd hours. This particular time, it was around 4 in the morning. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot, trying to gather my thoughts and jot down notes for my report, when I noticed something in my peripheral vision. I distinctly saw the blue of a hospital gown, but when I turned to look, no one was there. I chalked it up to being tired and went back to my notes. After a few minutes, I caught another glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. This time, I saw someone when I looked up. Standing on the curb in front of the hospital was a man in his mid to late 50s. He was wearing a hospital gown and holding on to something metal that looked like a crutch. He wasn't leaning on it. His expression was one of wide-eyed shock, and his mouth was slightly open, as if he was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. I started looking around for hospital staff, because this man didn't seem like he should be outside alone. His skin was an unsettling pale color, and he was barefoot. The shadows obscured his feet, but his hands and fingers looked bruised. As I was scanning the area for help, our eyes met. I felt a chill run through me, but I got out of my car to help guide him back inside. When I looked up again, he was gone. I searched the parking lot thoroughly, but he was nowhere to be found. There's no way he could have disappeared so quickly in the mere seconds it took me to open my car door. I don't know how to describe it without sounding dramatic, but my skin crawled when he looked at me. He had the look of someone who was slowly realizing he had just passed away and didn't know what to do next. I still think about it sometimes. During med school, we had an anatomy exam scheduled for November 1st. On Halloween night, my roommate and I decided to use the fact that everyone else was out celebrating to get some quiet study time. The basement of the med school, where we were studying surrounded by cadavers, was already pretty unsettling. About an hour into our study session, as we were deeply immersed in our anatomy review, we suddenly heard a faucet turn on from the far end of the lab. These faucets are motion activated, and we were on the complete opposite side of the room. We exchanged uneasy glances but tried to brush it off and continued studying. Soon after, the faucet on the other side of the room turned on again. This happened a few more times over the next hour, each time from a different location in the lab. Feeling increasingly unnerved, we decided it was time to leave. As we gathered our belongings, we noticed a side room where instructors usually prepare their lectures and exams. Curious, we decided to peek inside. To our shock, we saw someone we didn't recognize, hunched over a cadaver with their back to the door. Despite our noisy entrance, this person remained focused on their work. We were both spooked, especially since we hadn't heard anyone come in. Without another word, we quietly backed out and hurriedly left the lab. There's probably some medical explanation for this, but it's still the strangest thing I've witnessed as a nurse so far. We had a very strong-willed but confused elderly lady on our floor. Her room was right in front of the nurse's station, so we could keep a close watch on her. And she also had one of our nurse aides as a sitter. She was always struggling, kicking, and trying to get out of bed. She's very restless and agitated, like some patients I've had before who were near the end. One day, we were called into her room as her heart rate started to drop. She lay there very still with her eyes open. The heart rate plummeted down to 30, then 20, and then it flatlined. We checked for a pulse and found none. She had a do not resuscitate order, so we did not attempt to bring her back. We closed her eyes and called her family as we prepared to get the body bag. The sitter stayed in the room to begin preparing the body. Less than 10 minutes later, she called us back in. The elderly lady was at it again, hitting, kicking, and trying to get out of bed. She came back to life on her own. Honestly, we found the situation amusing, and I've never seen any patient come back on their own like that. Even more surprising is she eventually made it out of the hospital too. I was a fresh intern in a sprawling university hospital. Like many hospitals in the UK, part of it is cutting edge, while another part hasn't seen a coat of paint since the 1970s. Much of the older section has been in use for years, but late at night, interns would navigate these closed wards and corridors as shortcuts when under pressure. My cardiac arrest alarm went off around 3 a.m. In case you're wondering, this alarm is called a code in America. I was on the ground floor of the old section, and the call was at the far end of the top floor of the same area. I dashed up 5 flights of stairs to reach the correct floor, but ended up on the wrong side. I had to pass through a vast abandoned ward that was completely pitch black to get to the ward I needed. As I sprinted down a long dark corridor, huffing and puffing, I nearly collided with an elderly woman. She grabbed my arm, and I'll never forget how ice cold her grip was. She asked me where is the way out in a calm voice. I pointed back toward where I had just come from and told her to take the elevators. I continued my sprint. I was the first doctor to arrive at the bedside where a nurse was performing CPR. Another was preparing adrenaline. I went to the head of the bed to manage the airway. When I looked down, I kid you not, it was the same elderly woman I had met in the corridor.